Thanks, Declan. When I hear you say tapestry, I'm thinking I'm dropping stitches all over the place, and it's been about survival. So, that's where I'd be coming from. But thank you. I'm really pleased to be here, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me, Vista Tech, and it's an exciting afternoon. That's me, and here we go. I'm going to talk to you a little bit this afternoon about leadership, both in a national and in an international context, because that's what my background is. Hopefully I can share a few things that I've learned along the way with you. So I would say that within leadership you need 3 T's as I define them, and that's talent being the first one. And I think before you go for any role, and I've just moved into a new role as Vice President of Digital Content with Lonely Planet, you've got to believe that you've got a vision for the area that you're working in. You've got to have a sense that you understand what is required and that you can lead people and bring them on a journey. And I say to people at the moment, we have a journey of 100 steps ahead of us. We're at step 1 right now, and the first thing we need to understand is, can I learn? Am I secure in my abilities as a leader? Am I open to new ways of doing things? And that would be very much my approach. The second T, I would say, is tenacity. And that's for anybody going into any role. How badly do you want it? Are you prepared to work harder? Are you prepared to make the sacrifices required to be the best that you can be in your environment? And how resilient are you? Because there are going to be many setbacks along the way. That is simply the way it operates. And you've got to be sure that you can keep going against all odds. And the third T I would identify is temperament. How do I deal with stress? Am I fair? Am I professional? Do I bring positive energy? Do I have a sense of humour in the environment that I'm in? I remember actually going for the first role that I worked in Lonely Planet about 5 years ago. I was based in London as managing destination editor, and our content model has been for the last 5 years that we have what we called universal content. So essentially we would send writers out to destinations, and we have printed about 150 million guidebooks over the last 45 years. We would have about 13 million unique users monthly on our website, and we would have another 12 to 14 million followers in social media. So quite a big audience. And I remember going to the interview and saying, well, it's a bit like newspapers. I used to be editor of the Sunday Tribune in Ireland before it closed. And, nowadays you can't just go out and cover one thing. You've got to do everything. So I likened it to when I used to cover the courts way back for the Irish Times more than 20 years ago. And you would, in those days, go in, you would listen to what was happening in court, you would take your notes, you would come out, you would ring the copy taker and you would call over your story, and it would appear in print for the Irish Times the following day, for an evening newspaper that evening. And in my first interview with Lonely Planet, I said, that's all obsolete. Nowadays, you've got to go into court. You might have to engage with social media in court. You've got to come out. You might do a podcast. You'll also do some written content, but you'll be sending the content that you've written as opposed to having somebody take it from you. And you may need to do some visual as well. You may need to take images or do a little bit of video. And that was the expectation I had of our writers when I went into Lonely Planet. And boy, did I learn that was not a good expectation. It was a very unfair one, actually, because, some people are very good at some things and some people are very good at other things. And we had an expectation that everybody could do everything. And of course, in that, the quality suffers. And that is the bottom line. And I think by explanation of the role I'm going into now, it is that we no longer view universal content as being the way forward for us. In that model, the writer goes out and kind of does nearly everything, but sends back copy that is not written to length. It's just copy that can be used then by the digital team and by the print team. And it hasn't worked for us. On the print side, we then pay curators to cut the content to length, which nobody else does in the media landscape anymore. People are commissioned to write 1,000 words or 10,000 words or whatever, and they write to length. So we haven't been doing that. And then on the digital side, we haven't had content that's digitally purposed. It's kind of reusing book content in a digital context. And that's not appropriate either in terms of being competitive. And that landscape is incredibly competitive. So we've now decided to have 2 separate teams. We know print, we're doing it for 45 years, we've printed a lot of books, we don't want to do anything that breaks that model, but the truth is the trajectory in print is in one direction, it's downwards. And we are the leaders in our market, but we have to prepare for a future that is digital. So our intention now is to build our digital business, which we're investing in extensively, and that will mean, digital content is one part of that. Lots of other things come into that as well, and we're at the beginning of that journey. So that's by way of a little bit of explanation as to why I am talking about leadership right now. So with thanks to Simon, who has dickied up my original images here and made it look a hell of a lot better than I did originally. I would say to you that leadership is knowing when to praise and when to criticise. To me, that's a very important element of one of the many elements that you require. I started working in the Irish Times a very long time ago. I remember working for a guy who's no longer there, who essentially, when you did something right, he called you and he whispered down the phone that you'd done a good job. And when you did something wrong, he told you in front of the entire newsroom. So with the result, you spent a lot of time feeling very unfairly done by and hard done by. And that's why I say, I think, knowing when to praise and when to criticise. And sometimes in a millennial culture, and I work in many of those, both here and in the UK and in the United States, everyone's a legend and everyone's amazing. And you're going, no, you're doing your job. You know, let's differentiate. Let's just identify this is your job and this is over and above. And I think you've got to be really careful in that regard. Taking time to think, to me, this is an important element of leadership. Sorry, I've lost my notes here somewhere, so I'm going to get back on track in a minute and stop rabbiting on. I think, you know, being able to step back from what you're involved in, having a day like this. In fact, I was sitting there listening to Kevin and I was thinking about digital transformation and what I need to do in my environment. And I think being able to step away from the everyday operational and be strategic and make time to be strategic. And it can be very difficult when you're in a demanding role. But to me, it's an important element. Hiring the right people, well, it says the obvious, you know. I always say to people, I'm either absolutely astounding at hiring people or I'm absolutely appalling. I never hire mediocre people. So the people that I hire generally go on to really good things, and then sometimes I get it really badly wrong. And I think it's very important to address that very quickly, because if you have the wrong fit within your organisation or within your team, it's like a nuclear bomb going off. And it's the quickest way to lose good people is to bring in somebody who doesn't work out. And I know it can be difficult in environments like the one we're in now in relation to our labour laws. It's a lot easier in the United States, where I work a lot. You know, there's a lot of employment at will there. So essentially people have very little security in their roles. There are downsides to that as well, because there's very little transition. And, you know, I've hired people for jobs that have said, I've worked for that guy for the last 6 years. He's fantastic. I really love the environment. I want to be fair about my notice period. 2 weeks. You know, and that's that environment. Whereas in this environment, people do have rights. People do have, we have responsibilities to them. But I think if you make a wrong decision in terms of a person that you are employing, the fairest thing to do is to let them go as quickly as possible. Sometimes it can work, and you can, you know, occasionally it can work in terms of managing that person to be better. But in my experience, very often it is better to cut your losses. Trusting your staff. I think it's hugely important. A lesson I learned, I used to be editor of the Sunday Tribune. We closed in 2011. I think back to when I started in that role and we were going to transform the newspaper, and we did, and we won awards all over the place. We didn't generate enough revenue, so we eventually closed. But I remember having to do the first round of redundancies, and it was after motivating people and, you know, really being inspirational in terms of what we could achieve, and the sky was the limit. And then suddenly there isn't enough revenue and you're going to have to identify who you let go. And I agonised about it at the time. And I remember when eventually the decision was made, and of course the decision was made that you looked at the productivity of what, you know, was happening, what could you live without. And it was the people who had been there the longest and probably were really well liked. And I thought this was going to go down really badly with staff. And in actual fact, their response was way different to what I expected. They understood completely why the decision was made. And in fact, sometimes you can just empower good people when they see that the decision is fair, that it's reasonable, it's in the business's interests, we're not a not-for-profit, and we've got to make this work. Now, in the end, it's a long story and probably a whole other presentation, but we cut the fat, we cut the muscle, we cut the bone, and there was nothing left to cut. So we closed. But ultimately, and speaking as somebody who comes from the creative side of the house in content, you know, if you don't generate enough revenue, it doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter how many awards you win. It doesn't matter how people who still meet me in the street and say, loved the Sunday Tribune, and you're going, pity you didn't buy it, you know. But that was our fault too, you know. We didn't move with the times. We didn't have the resources to invest when we should have invested. And it was really a lesson. And it is, I think, for anybody who's been in a business that's failed, it's a scar in your life. It's not a good experience. But boy, is it a learning experience. And as I say, somebody who's coming from the creative side, I'm very focused on the bottom line now and really focused on tracking where we're at and how we're spending and what value we're getting for what we do. So, yeah, I would say, you know, a couple of things, you know, Strategy is the easy bit in any role. Dealing with people is the hard bit, and getting people to do what you want them to do is the hard bit. So I'd say, don't personalise conflict, separate issues, because very often when people have problems, it's a load of things all at once, and you've got to pick out and see, well, what's in relation to their professional life and what's in relation to their personal life. And you've only got responsibility for one. Put a perspective on things, particularly people's passion, because sometimes your best employees are the ones who, want to be there all the time. And a bit like John was saying earlier on, you've got to get a balance in life. So it's not always the best thing to be the first in and the last out, and the one who, wants and puts every effort into it. You've got to balance it. You've got to put a perspective on it. And some of my hardest tasks, I would say, over the years have been getting people to understand that it's just a job. But it's a job you want to do to your best ability, and a job that you want to get satisfaction and fulfillment from. But it is just a job. It's not your whole life. Allies and networks. I found to my cost in one role that I was in, when I looked around me, I had no allies. I was like a cuckoo in the nest. And I think maybe there's an element of being a woman, maybe there's an element of just being at a certain level or being in a certain industry. And when you're in the media industry, it has been dog eat dog for a very long time. It is in decline, so therefore different behaviours come out in those environments. So I would say build allies and networks of people that you can rely on, people that you can sense check off, people, who get what you're trying to achieve. Because sometimes, I can lose perspective on my passion as well. I need somebody that can, that I can trust, that can give me that perspective. And yeah, I was going to leave this one out, but now we're on it. It's the woman thing. There's always, I think if you're a woman and you're in senior management roles, you're conscious of that. Not so much now, because I don't get sexual harassment now, but I certainly did going up along the lines. And it wasn't ever that I was the hottest chick in the room. It was often just I was the only chick in the room. And depending on the environment you're in, it's how you handle that. It's how you deal with it. There is legislation there for anything of a serious nature. But for most of us, it's every day. And this could be your boss or your client or, somebody that you're going to have an ongoing relationship with. And what I say to women, and sometimes I talk to universities or to younger women, come at it with humour. Try insofar as you can. And I would say that is the case, not just in relation to sexism, but in relation to cultural differences, in relation to working in a global environment, to try and, come at things not too seriously, to try and find a little lighter way to connect with people, so that you're not always, intense and it's not always really serious, or people aren't intimidated or afraid to bring up issues. And I know it's easy to say it, and sometimes I say to girls when I'm talking to them in colleges, practice your put-down lines. If you feel you're in an environment where you're getting these sexist put-downs, stand in front of the mirror at night and come up with good put-down lines, because in the moment you won't think of it. And it's just that little bit empowering. So, some people in the room this resonates with. Some people are going, what is she talking about? I'm not sure. but I'm just giving you my experience. And I would say that, there is competition. The worst competition always for me is a little voice in your own head that says, what are you at? What do you think you're doing? You're useless, A bit like John was saying earlier, do you sit on the positive side of the train or do you sit on the negative side of the train? And I think it's really important to understand that, you're doing your best, to give yourself a bit of a break in that regard, to take a step away from it and try and think about it in a different way. And I would say Steve Jobs kind of, said it all when he said, as is here, your time is limited, don't waste it, don't be trapped, don't listen to other opinions, do what you think is right, and, have the courage to follow your heart, your intuition. And I think when you're sincere, when you're authentic, when you try to be who you are yourself, people tend to respond to that. And you try to be fair, you try to be reasonable in every environment, and you hope it works. I hope it does. If I don't get traffic in Lonely Planet to 25 million in a year, somebody else will be standing here. It won't be me. So, but I'll give it my best shot in the interim, and I think that's all any of us can do. Thank you very much.